More Skallagrim. Are swords really good for super strong characters? Now, obviously, when you go into different types of swords, right? Whereas I myself use a German longsword when I go into rapier in the SCA, right? I mean, there's certain advantages a quick and nimble rapier is going to have over somebody like me using a longsword, right? I mean, there's just a difference there. Yes, it's legal for the format. Don't worry about it. I'm aware that I'm at a disadvantage when I use that longsword. Not necessarily that like, bigger is better. Yes, you do have extended reach, but your opponent could also have more expertise than you. They could be more nimble than you. They could understand what they're doing a lot better than you. So I'm very curious what Skallagrim's take is, and I love that we already have the Ringed City Knight here to kind of ease us into the presentation.
Will giant swords ever stop being a popular fantasy trope?
No.
Probably not, regardless of how little sense they make. And I know they don't need to make sense because it's just fantasy. But there's still internal logic, right? The logic here being that there's superhuman strength at play.
I do think that the logic there is, yes, there's superhuman strength at play. Generally, you see the dude with the bigger sword, and you're like, oh, he's got the bigger sword. He can use that bigger sword. I like the dude with the big sword, right? From an Unga Bunga standpoint, right? Plus, you have reach. You potentially have, depending on the size of the sword, leverage, right? I would argue someone using a rapier with one hand, if I got into a bind with them and I'm using a long sword because I have a bigger sword, but I also have the leverage provided by a long sword's, the pommel as well as the grip, right? Just all of that. I could out leverage them all day. I mean, it is a cost benefit analysis of what you're using.
What if we had that in real life? The thing is, we actually sort of have a superpower in the form of technology.
Yeah.
With machines, we can perform feats of strength that would have been absolutely unthinkable before.
Yeah.
If that's the kind of thing you like to indulge in, today's sponsor of War Thunder's got you covered. It's
Nice.
a large-scale vehicular combat game with more than 2,000 tanks, ships, planes, and helicopters from a century of military history. The in-game models are highly detailed and geared towards realism. Individually destructible components and crew health are immersive and add complexity to the gameplay. Fortunately, it's not so realistic that you need to be a pilot to figure out how to even point the things in the right direction. The controls are intuitive and efficient, so you can just focus on tactical maneuvering and blowing stuff up, which will reward you with impressive visual effects. War Thunder is free to play on PC, PS4 and 5, and the recent Xboxes. New players who sign up through the link in the description get a bonus pack with boosters, premium vehicles, and other extras. Check it out.
That was a really smooth ad transition, and I will continue my trend of if someone does a really good ad transition, we need to be like not calling that out. We need to be supporting that. We need to be recognizing that, because how many times have you been watching a video, right? And it's like, oh yeah, we're going to be talking in today's video. We're going to be talking about this subject, and the implications of this. And you know what you should do? Today's sponsor, right? And how it just kind of takes you out of the video, right? How it just like, you're just like, skip, right? When you do an ad read correctly, when you do an ad read really good, I think that it should be noticed. I think it should be commended, and absolutely just, hey, this is how you do this. This is awesome. This creator does awesome work, right? A good ad read, yes, is hard to find. So, Skallagrim, thank you for doing such an awesome ad read. It was a really good transition, and it's really underappreciated. Like, thank you for not having an ad read that absolutely just kills. just kills the flow.
If you could come up with a super soldier serum that multiplies peak human strength by a factor of whatever, 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 100.
Right.
If that was possible, then giant swords would make sense, right?
Not really.
No. Well, maybe, but probably not.
Yes and no.
What is a sword? A miserable little pile of steel.
I love it. Thank you for that. That was amazing. Yeah. 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 I would argue, it depends. Like, clearly we're looking at some sort of European sword, and the reason the crossguard is the reason why they're shaped like this, as far as I'm aware, was actually European church influence, if I remember that correctly, where it's obviously shaped like a cross, right? Whereas you get something like, and even Musashi, right, in the Five Rings refers to swords not as katana, but as long swords, right? So it's also dependent on your area. A sword can be a long sword. It can be a katana. It could be, I technically a messer isn't a sword. It's technically a knife. If you know, you know. If you know, hi. I love that you also know random history facts. But yeah, it just depends. Like, at the end of the day, I would have to justify a sword is a way to apply leverage and reach to get the pointy or slashy bit into somebody else, right? And obviously that's a broad overarching definition. You can get something like a falchion in there, you can get something like a rapier in there, you can get something like a longsword in there, short sword, broadsword, daggers of certain length, right? That kind of thing is how I would personally define it off the cuff. However, your Skallagrim's going to have a way better explanation.
I mean, what's the purpose of a sword? The practical purpose, status symbol and all that aside. Like any weapon, it's a force multiplier. Yeah. Just in a more refined way, I would argue.
That is a really sexy sword.
Leverage, edges, points, all amplify and concentrate force. But you do that at very little impact on maneuverability. You know, if you think about moving your bare hands, that's obviously the fastest and least energy intensive. As soon as you pick up an object to swing that around, it slows you down and requires more energy. A sword may do less so than many other weapons, absolutely dependent on the type of sword. There are types that require quite a bit of effort and energy and are not quick to swing around. What distinguishes a sword from most other weapons is its potential to retain much more agility compared to something like this, which has literally the reverse mass distribution. On a sword, most of the mass is in the hilt. On a hammer or an axe, most of it is near the end.
Yeah, and that's why you can use it to pivot and flex, right? So, for example, Skallagrim is holding this plane of steel out right there, right? If he needed to jerk this way and then thrust on in, all he needs to do is to really just shift the pommel over, because him being down here, with all the mass being down here, or most of the mass, I should say, what happens if he shifts the pommel over quickly using his second hand? Oh, suddenly your plane of steel is here, and then you just drop it down and run your opponent through, right? I mean, we see this all the time in SCA, right? Especially in longsword fighting, using that plane of steel. You know, like, how do I set up these planes of defense? And, oh, cool, I'm just going to eject you off one side, and then I'm going to come in the same tempo and a half, and just run you through, right? That kind of thing. Like, yeah, no, this makes a lot of sense.
So this, I can swing much more easily and faster than that, which of course is an advantage in combat. If you miss and it takes you longer to come back around for another swing, then it leaves you open.
Generally, I see swords as the most, like, multi-purpose tool, if that makes sense, right? Because what happens with a dagger, right? A dagger, cool, you might have that speed, you might even have the force multiplier on your arm, right? You might have certain angles going for you, but at a certain point, you have to close that gap. You are out of measure, and you need to close that gap. Well, mostly you're gonna be out of measure unless you're doing some stuff, right? Like in games, right? But like with a sword, you're still gonna start out of measure, but you have a lot more tools to work with a hammer, right, or a war pick, or anything on that, right, what Skallagrim's holding or adjacent to it, right? Yeah, you're going to have the ability to just use the mass of that head to just follow through with that strike, to just smack something real hard, as it were. And yes, you absolutely have the ability to do that, but your cooldown time, like if you're thinking of like an MMO global cooldown, right? You know, if you use your heavy swing, suddenly you have a full second before you can swing it again, versus maybe a sword class has like a thrust, right? Maybe it has 0.7 seconds to actually cool. Like, sword's going to be able to respond a little bit faster. It's going to have a lot less power, I would argue, against especially the upper portion of this. But it's going to have more utility. It's going to be kind of like it's good at many different things, but it doesn't necessarily specialize in a given thing as well as specialized instruments, right? If you want to thrust someone from afar, why are you just not using a bident, trident, spear, glaive, anything like that, right? Well, if you're looking for just sheer chopping power, why are you just not using an axe? Why are you not using a kukri? Depending on your distance, right? I find swords are kind of that middle ground where there's a lot you can do with them, and they might not necessarily do the best at anything, but they're fairly good as, you know, just doing things, if that makes sense.
But what if you're strong enough that this feels like a sword or even lighter? Obviously, it won't change the balance, but you'll be able to swing it at the same speed as your empty arm. Then, of course, this is not a problem at all. This falchion here is not particularly nimble because it's comparatively...
It is a specialized sword. That sword wants to do one thing. We're looking at the Five Rings Musashi's Path of the Blade, right? That, you know, each sword is going to want to do a specific thing, right? You're going to have a longsword. A longsword's going to want to thrust. It's going to want to make these large chopping motions with using that plane of steel. This is going to want to flow a little bit better. This is going to want to, you know, slash, right? Yeah, you can still run someone through with it. Don't get me wrong, but it's the Path of the Blade is a little different than that of just a European longsword.
Heavy for a single-handed sword. In my hands, if I was 2 or 3 or 4 times stronger, it wouldn't be a big deal at all. I could absolutely swing it very fast. And that's generally the argument for huge swords.
And Skallagrim actually does that perfectly.
Absolutely swing it very fast. And that's stronger.
See how he's resetting, right? So if we go back, how he's going there, and then he's just doing ribbon cuts is all he's doing, right? I mean, I've done this with longswords, I've done this with a claymore, right? Where, you know, you'll do your cut, and then you get above, and you cut down again. I would argue the angle of this is a lot wider here, but it's easier to maneuver than I would argue something like a claymore.
If I was 2 or 3 or 4 times stronger...
Right, and then see, you can, with one hand, you can twist it around and get ready for your next ribbon cut.
It wouldn't be a big deal at all. No, I could absolutely swing it very fast.
It's very efficient.
And that's generally the argument for huge swords. If the character has superhuman strength, they can handle it. Unless we're talking swords of such monstrous size that...
Yeah, the Buster Sword is a whole different class in itself.
That they would haul the user off their feet in spite of superhuman strength. Even that doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, because you could very well argue that a body with superhuman strength also needs to be denser than a regular human to withstand the forces. So superhuman...
I mean, muscle being dense, yeah. I mean, I could see the logic in this.
Strength might come with superhuman weight, at which point, all right, all fine and good. But even so, it's suboptimal. Real swords may sometimes look fair.
God, that is hot. That is a thick, strong part of the blade, right? Weak part, meh. Strong part, oh God, that is,
fairly heavy when you see them straight from the front, just going by the sheer size. But they
actually need to figure out what brand that is. I have a longsword that I got from a pawn shop, and like it's real steel, like it's combat ready. I can't use an SCA because it's actually sharp, right? I need to figure out what actual brand that is, because I actually know the on the side of his blade there. That's actually the mark they use. I need to figure out what brand this is. I need to buy more of their stuff. They're great. I love them.
But then you realize how thin they are and how much weight they save by doing that, which in turn can leave them fairly fragile, particularly if you want a thin edge, which for optimal cutting performance, you generally do. You want to basically balance the cutting ability and the durability, because the thicker the blade is and the steeper the edge grind, the more damage resistant it is, but also the worse it cuts and the more energy it requires to successfully complete a cut.
Right. So, and thus we get into the argument, well, what about the Zweihander, right? Isn't the Zweihander not even sharp? Actually, as far as I'm aware, its historical use case was that it was more used as like a pole arm because of its sheer size. But even then, like, you don't, as far as I'm aware, you don't have an edge, a sharp edge on a Zweihander. It is edge shaped. You have a edge on it, but it's not sharp. But when you're swinging around a Zweihander like that, it doesn't necessarily need to be sharp. Just the appearance and the effect of an edge is enough to just cleave through things. So, I mean, it depends on use case, right? I mean, I know especially Dark Souls 1, your fellow Giant Dad fans out there, right, are going to love the Zweihander, are going to be like, yeah, no, Zweihander rules. Zweihander is interesting. It was a club effect.
If you make them significantly thicker,
it's a
they're
club
much
with class.
harder to damage, and they require more energy to swing around. Now,
whatever this is, This is great. I love this. This is efficient. It's effective. It's meaty. It's girthy. I was going to say it's ugly, but it's not ugly. Actually, I'm actually really loving this.
That sounds great in case of increased strength. So if you're at 2 or 3 or 5 times peak human strength,
right,
you can swing that around, no problem. But is there really no problem? At that point, you're generating that much more force. Sure, the thing is more robust,
and a machete,
but how much harder are you hitting now? And there's still an edge.
Right.
So,
which, yes, Chad is right, where it doesn't need to be sharp if you have enough momentum. So that could be how you kind of solve that.
If the edge is sturdier, it requires more energy to cut through, which, concentrates more force on a thinner piece of metal. So that makes it, again, more prone to damage. If you have a large, thick sword swung with 10 times human strength, or even 100 times, enough to cut a car in half, or a building, or whatever,
you better hit that shot. You get one shot, because the actual time it will take to get your next hit off is going to be monstrously long. You better hit that hit. If you're not going to hit it, your opponent's just going to capitalize on that.
That's still going to be damaged. Unless it's magically indestructible, you would most likely chip the hell out of the edge and very possibly bend or just shatter the whole thing.
Yeah,
so
that too.
Why not use something more robust? Like a hammer or an axe, ideally with all steel construction, or whatever the best material is you have available. There are historical...
Look, all I'm going to say is I've had to fight spears in SCA, because spears are legal for rapier format. Like, God, I can't imagine giving a spear an edge like this. Because they can use that half to block at absolute worst case scenario, and they're able to weave in and out super quick. Like, it's actually cracked. Fighting spears is just built different.
Battle axes and warhammers with all metal hafts. Sometimes they're made of solid metal, sometimes they're a hollow tube with a wooden core inside to prevent the tube from denting, which would compromise its strength.
Some sort of metal,
you could do something like that for a character with supernatural strength, just upscaled to an extent. What I've got here is a kanabo or tetsu.
Oh my God. Oh, these things are nasty. Oh, I love them, though. I want one.
A studded wooden war club.
Actually,
so
disgusting.
Thing would hit very hard and is not quite as fragile as a sword.
The Shigoki from For Honor uses a kanabo.
Now, one problem is this is made pretty thick. This is oak wood, by the way, which, of course, naturally is quite a hard wood. But it's also...
Hear me out. Mahogany. If you didn't know, that's the ongoing meme, is that anytime wood comes up, anytime I get something wood, it's always mahogany. So thus, get a kanabo, but in mahogany. And that is the meme.
Made pretty thick, presumably to avoid this breaking, because you can have a massive striking end and a skinny little handle that simply cannot support all that and would fracture under impact or just snap in half. Now, what makes this awkward is if you still have human-sized hands, this is a lot harder to hold on to. Like, you can see that I can't actually fully close my hand here. My thumb doesn't wrap all the way around. This is depending on hand size.
It's a big stick for a big man. I mean, the jokes will write themselves. That actually didn't come out as a joke, but the jokes will write themselves.
Of course. But even the largest human hands will reach a point where they just can't hold on to it properly anymore. Like, imagine this entire thing was twice the size. Yeah. And now this is closer to that end as just the grip. And now you're trying to hold on to it like this and make sure it doesn't slip out of your fingers.
He brings up a good point. He does bring up a good point in, like, it has to be proportional. If you have the same size half with double the girth of this, right? I mean, suddenly you're going to run into structural integrity issues, would you not? Like, he brings up good points. So unless you are just the Shigoki from For Honor, maybe just this big mountain of a man, and you got these big hands, right? I mean, I don't see it necessarily going over well unless there were some maybe accommodations made or some customizations made. But even then, if you cut into this or try to modify this in any way, you could also be losing structural integrity. A lot to consider in regard to that. But man, the Kanabo is such a it's a big F off stick, and I love it.
As you swing with superpower, that doesn't really work too well. Anyway, that's just as a side note, because one of my pet peeves is seeing gigantic weapons that have really, really chunky handles that the character can't actually hold on to properly. The other pet peeve being the reverse, where the handle is the right size, but everything else is so grotesquely oversized that it looks like a matchstick glued to a skateboard.
Yeah, like the structural integrity on this is sus, and this has to be magically enforced in some capacity. Zabuza's sword, I'm a little more willing to forgive, especially if it's a lighter metal, because we also know that like it's some sort of weird chakra blade that is able to use the blood of fallen enemies and the iron within it to restore itself. But even then, I totally get that criticism, though. I actually get that criticism where no, the handle doesn't quite. This one's probably the most proportional out of all of these. This just doesn't. It doesn't look right.
It just screams snap right here.
Yeah.
If this was made entirely of steel or maybe even some super alloy, it would be significantly heavier, but it would stand up to superhuman use. And as long as you tweak it properly so that it does not exceed the character's ability to swing with enough speed, then yeah, you're good. So that's why I find giant swords kind of weird. Yeah. Counterintuitive, if you will. They're too fragile for a power weapon, but not nimble enough for a finesse weapon. So there's this awkward in between.
Right, and so Monster Hunter swords just built different. Literally, they're made of weird crystals and monster bones and stuff. Right, so you have some sort of material. Due to our technological advancements, if we were to make that, our own laws of physics and our own limitations will in fact succeed that there, right? Zabuza's sword, unless constructed in a very specific capacity, I'm sure, yes, would have that stress point being where the handle meets the actual sword. Please snap here, as Skallagrim says, right? Any of the other Monster Hunter swords and stuff like that, you know, you're going to have those stress points. But because you either have magic infusion, you either have monster parts or weird crystal magic potentially, I mean, that's where the fantasy element of that comes into play. Like, I totally get it.
Now, you can have a large sword that is still fairly nimble. We did that in history. You know, there are two-handed swords that are about the size of the user or a little bit shorter that are nowhere near as heavy as you would expect.
Look at this absolute Chad. Like, to have facial hair just that robust, if you will. These are the Chads of all time.
I made a video about that, by the way, if you haven't seen that. It can be upscaled if you have elevated strength as a fictional character. But considering that there are plenty of weapon types which are way more damaging, with the only caveat that they're kind of clunky, if you can compensate for that with extra strength and actually make them fast, they're the better option. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to grab the welcome package with plenty of bonuses through the link in the description below. In all fairness, swords can still make sense for characters with both super strength and super toughness who fight each other if you simply upscale everything to maintain the same sort of dynamics.
Yeah.
To where this sword is now thicker, sturdier, larger, whatever, and still feels the same to this super strong character as it would to a regular person. I
mean, upscaling things doesn't always work, though, right? What is there on YouTube? There's the popular AK-50 project, right? And it's not as simple as we're just going to blow this up 2-3 times to accommodate a 50 cal round, right? It's you have to. There's some surface area calculations that have gone into that in regards to integrity, stability, having to take certain liberties with the initial design to make it work at an upscaled capacity. So sometimes, yeah, you can just be like, I want to take that small sword and I want to make it larger. You have a long sword turn into a claymore, right? But sometimes it's not that simple, especially when you start getting into more refined weaponry. I don't think, for example, a rapier, if it were the size of a claymore, would work the same as a rapier that works, in your single-handed capacity, right?
with a regular sword. And then you can have this fight where, okay, yeah, they put a lot more
firearms
energy
is also
into it. They hit harder, but they can also take more, and the blades are durable enough to withstand that.
Yeah.
But I said a sword, or at least most types of swords, are not what you would consider a power weapon.
No.
Right? Hope that makes sense.
No.
Thanks for watching. Hope you found it interesting, and take care, folks.
Nah, mass produce swords, give them to your grunts and mooks, call it good. You're set, you're fine. If you want your experienced units, okay, cool. Now we can start talking about like pole arms, we can start talking about other things, right? I mean, especially in the era, right, where you're gonna have, you know, down to your peasant class, right, and you're gonna be handing out stuff to them. Technically in Europe, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have access to swords themselves because metal is going to be expensive and thus would be a status symbol, so you probably give them a spear or something like that. But I mean, modern day, I mean, realistically, like, modern day in period setting, right? I mean, your sword is going to be able to give you the most utility in a situation where peasants could have spears, or they could have other implements as such, and they can, you know, do a basic or like two basic tasks with that. So, I digress. What are your thoughts on this? As somebody who, you know, loves SCA and is planning on actually getting into armor again and actually doing stuff, you know, I'm very interested in thoughts and opinions. What are your thoughts on, you know, European swords versus what, you know, Eastern swords? Do you think that it tracks with swords kind of being that multi-purpose baseline? I can do many things, but not specialize in one thing very well unless you start specializing into like falchions, etc. You know, yeah. Let me know. Let me know in the comments section. And Skallagrim, thank you for making such an excellent video. As somebody who loves history, somebody that loves implements of swords and the like. You do put out great content and have put out great content for many years, and I hope I'm being respectful of your content as well as I can, providing enough commentary. And if you haven't seen Skallagrim, or if you're discovering Skallagrim through me, you should absolutely go check out Skallagrim. He's an awesome individual. Just, dude's super legit, all I can say. But alas, I will see you all in the next one.